Hey, what's going on, everyone? I'm Vinny Costa, editor of Street Muscle Magazine, brought to you by Lucas Oil. Today, I'm joined by my co-host, Greg Costa, editor of Engine Labs and the all-around tech guru. What's up, Greg?
Yo, how you doing, Vinny?
I'm good, man. I'm really good. Today, we have a cool episode for you. I know Rob and I filmed this one when you were off at the Performance Engine Building Expo, as you are the tech guru. So you were called away on crucial business.
Yes, I'm not really here. This is all an illusion.
I had to carry on in your stead, but I think we did a good job. We talked about the new James Bond movie, what it means for pop culture and automotive culture, and we also talked about a lot of the cars in that film, because unfortunately, it doesn't exactly fit Street Muscle's motif as far as content is concerned. And so, while Rob can't do conventional Rob's movie review on that film, we figured this would be a good way to review that film anyways. So yeah, I know you're eager to get into it, Greg. I can see by your face. Actually, it's a really great movie. I enjoyed it. So spoiler alert, you guys, you heard my opinion. Oh, also, I should say right away, spoiler alert right now, Rob and I talk about, later in the episode, we talk about things that happen in the movie. So if you haven't seen it, go watch the movie, then come back and watch the podcast.
At Silver Sport Transmissions, we believe classic cars and trucks look their best on the open road, and four-wheel drives belong on the trail. We continue to innovate and develop the best overdrive transmission packages for muscle cars, street rods, classic trucks, and four-wheel drive vehicles. Our commitment to customer service and integrity is second to none. When the wrenches begin to turn, Silver Sport Transmissions is there. Hit the trail with Silver Sport Transmissions.
Rob Finkelman, welcome back, dude.
Yeah, it's good to see you, man. We've taken a break for a few weeks on doing any sort of podcast, and I've missed you. So I've missed doing it.
Yeah, I got so used to you just being a regular on the show that I was like, man, we've done a few shows without Rob. I missed that guy. We need to get him back on. So thank you.
Yeah. I was going to start asking for increased riches for doing these shows, because I essentially was a third host for a while there. So
here pretty soon, hopefully we can kind of finagle it to where you can come on as a guest host. We're working on somebody that's actually related to today's episode. Obviously, we're talking about the new James Bond movie.
Yes, sir.
At home, I want to start right off by saying, spoiler alert, we are going to talk about the new movie. We're going to talk about how it ends and some of the stuff that happens. So if you don't want to hear any of that, go watch the movie and then come back and watch this.
Right.
Yeah, so hopefully we get to talk with the stunt coordinator from that film. We're still working that out. But if we do, Rob, I would love it if you came on and acted as host in my stead.
I would love to do that, and I'm looking forward to the opportunity to interview him, because there was some, I think you would agree, some pretty serious car action and stunt work done in the film, and I'm proud on behalf of the filmmakers to say that like 99% of it were actual stunts, as opposed to the CGI garbage we see in a lot of fast and frivolous movies and whatever today.
We can talk about it. I mean, I think, for fans of yours who have read, many of your articles and your columns, they know that you are not so much a fan of, that CGI kind of just fake rubbish, as it were. Like, not all of it's bad, it has its place, I suppose, but
oh, absolutely. I mean, what people need to understand is CGI can be a wonderful tool. In fact, there are many movies out these days that the stories themselves couldn't be told in an effective manner without the advent of CGI. So in that respect, it's great. but as you said, I do have a problem with it because it can be misused. And by misuse,
You don't
I
want it to
mean,
be a crutch, right?
what's that?
You don't want it to be a crutch, right? Like,
Yeah, it should be a subtle tool to improve storytelling, just like anything else, like editing. Most people who go into a film, they don't notice cuts and how things are being cut, but there is an actual language to editing. There's a subtext to it. And a good editor can actually take mediocre footage that was filmed and turn it into a superb film. I could list a number of examples over the years of films that were saved by editing, saved by cinematography, even saved by sound work. You'd be shocked. I took a class at NYU Film School 20, 30 years ago, and it was called, I actually forget the name of the class, but instead of watching movies in the theater that we had at NYU, we'd listen to them. They'd actually run a film, and we'd be sitting in a theater with surround sound or what they had back in that day, which I think was just simply Dolby Surround, which was like a 3-speaker setup. But we'd listen to films and gain an appreciation for what sound design does for storytelling. It was a fabulous class. I remember we watched Apocalypse Now with no picture. We just listened to the sound. And that was really the first film ever made with an advanced multi-track sound design. And you can, just by listening to that movie, and I would urge people interested in this topic to, at home, stream or throw in a DVD of Apocalypse Now, leave your TV off, but leave your processor or your preamp on and just listen to the film. You know exactly what's going on at any given moment just through the sound design. That's how incredibly advanced it was. And all of these are tools to storytelling. Where CGI gets in trouble is when a director says, oh, I want to just blow everybody away with a stunt, and decides that it would be too expensive or too dangerous or impossible to do it in real life with a stuntman behind the wheel. And it urges some less proficient directors to end up doing things that look really stupid on screen, where you're just sitting there saying, this is so fake. And sadly, the Fast and Furious franchise, which if you watch the first Fast and Furious, is such a great film because it's a small story. It had never been done before. It was really unique. And all the racing was practical in that first film. They actually did 99% of those stunts were real. And then you look at Fast and the Furious 23 or whatever the latest installment was this past year, and they're driving cars out of buildings and they're landing on 4 wheels, and it's just all CGI. And it takes you out of the believability of the moment. Movies are supposed to suspend your disbelief, not encourage disbelief. And that's where CGI gets in trouble for me.
It's become so popular, I guess just because technology has allowed it to, but also I feel like it's created this this film industry that's gotten so lazy with storytelling. Like
yes.
every movie is a superhero movie, or or trying to be that, and it's even like you're saying, the Fast and Furious franchise, like they're going into space and they're like fighting wars and like shooting machine guns and like doing all this crazy stuff. And it's like, what does that have to do with the original movie at all? Like, how did we get here?
They started off with being like low-level thieves and drag car enthusiasts, and now there's superheroes fighting villains with nuclear weapons. I mean, it's just gotten so stupid. And yeah, I mean, that's a crutch. That's the perfect word. You brought it up before. When you don't have talented screenwriters, studios will just say, oh, well, we'll just throw tons of CGI on it and we'll blow up a lot of crap and people will still like it. Well, that might be true. There's a certain audience that just goes to movies to see, people get shot and cars blowing up and what have you. But you're going to lose people like you and I who have an appreciation for storytelling. If you look, what's that?
So you can have both.
Oh, of course you can have both. I mean, there's any number of films throughout history where you have both. I mean, going back to like 2001 Space Odyssey, Star Wars, the Indiana Jones movies. These were highly effects-driven movies, but the effects were woven around a very structured story with great characters and cause and effect loops and all the intricacies of fine writing. It wasn't just 2 hours of crap blowing up, and that's what you get a lot today.
How much pressure are these new directors and writers seeing from the studio to produce things like this instead of something of substance?
I don't think it's so much the filmmakers' fault, i.e. the directors. It's really what the studios think they can make the most money off of. It used to be there used to be a system in Hollywood which was called the spec script market. And that was a situation where a writer wasn't paid or commissioned to write a film. He just wrote it by himself, gave it to his agent, and the agent sometimes managed to sell it. And some of the great films of American history were originally spec scripts. And some of them not even based on literature or anything, sometimes just completely original screenplays. Reservoir Dogs was a spec script. In fact, all of the early Quentin Tarantino films were all spec. He never got paid a dime up front in the early years to come up with Reservoir Dogs, Pulp Fiction, Jackie Brown, any of those things, True Romance. Those were ideas he had when he was a nerd working at a video store who just loved movies beyond anything else in his life and wrote those films, having been influenced by the gangster films and stuff that he particularly gravitated to in his own time. And they were just so good, and he had a good enough agent or manager to get those scripts to talent agencies, production companies, studios, what have you, that they bought him. Well, that kind of market doesn't exist anymore in Hollywood. I could go into a long explanation of why, but what it basically amounts to is like anything else in this world, that's money. Feature film production has gotten so expensive. I'll give you an example. Back in 1990, the average cost of producing a 2-hour-long feature film, the average cost was about $10 million. Today, the average cost of a studio feature film is $75 million.
Wow.
Now, inflation has not gone up. That's an exponential cost rise over, the value of the dollar and inflation and so forth. And what that ended up doing was making the studios extremely risk averse. They don't want to take chances on little stories about people. They want something, if they're going to invest that kind of money, they want to put asses in seats in movie theaters. And now, of course, streaming at home. And they've convinced themselves that no one wants to see anything but Spider-Man or Godzilla or Fast and the Furious. And basically now, instead of them buying scripts from quality writers, the studios themselves will say, well, it's time for Fast and the Furious 13. Who do we hire? And they actually hire someone to come up with some awful idea for a script and for a movie, and then pay them to write the script. So it's the studios themselves that are picking what to do, are essentially also creating the content themselves. and are shying away from any risk whatsoever. They're just going for that big budget extravaganza now. And that's why you've seen Superman done and redone over the past 2 decades, Spider-Man over and over and over again. Like the whole Marvel universe and you know, everything attached to it, Justice League, X-Men. Those movies proved to be so profitable in the early 2000s when they first started coming out with them, that now Hollywood has really whittled down what they will produce to basically those films. If you want to get anything else made these days, you have to go through an independent route.
Really? Well,
yeah, pretty much.
So when I went to go see the new James Bond, No Time to Die, all the previews, so this is the first movie I've gone to the theater to watch in a very long time. You know, even COVID aside, right? Like even before then, I used to go all the time, when I was younger. But you know, at some point I just stopped because there wasn't anything that I really wanted to go see. Mm-hmm. And so when I went to go see the new Bond movie, and I'm watching the previews, and like every other preview was a remake of an old movie. I guess they were advertising a new series, like a streaming series for I Know What You Did Last Summer, which was, of course, like one of the great slasher flicks of like the, you know, early 2000s or like late 90s that I love. And so I don't know, how do we get out of this cycle of just like regurgitation and just...
Well, you don't, provided that these movies keep making money. The only way to snap out of it historically has been when a very talented filmmaker comes along, which is once in a generational, you know, generation type figure, whose ideas capture the zeitgeist, and their filmmaking marks a departure from what was previously going on. And you can count those kind of filmmakers on both of your hands throughout American history. I mean, you look back, my favorite period of filmmaking was the late 60s and 70s in America, because there was a paradigm shift in Hollywood. Before that era, it was kind of like what's going on today. Big budget extravaganzas. Everything was Ben-Hur or Spartacus or Cleopatra, like big historical epics with bankable stars, Elizabeth Taylor and Rock Hudson, James Dean. And if you weren't one of those people, or it wasn't that kind of material, it kind of didn't get made in Hollywood. That was known as the studio era, where the big studios were packaging bankable stars with big budget ideas, extravaganzas. And then along came the late 60s, where there was a lot of cultural change in our country. There was a lot of drugs that were entering mainstream life that was creating a new way of thinking about America, about life amongst young people. And that started to be reflected because a new wave of young filmmakers who were themselves taking drugs and who were themselves interested in looking at the world in a different way, that started to be reflected in films when these young directors were first given a chance to make movies. And then all of a sudden, some of those movies were just making incredible splashes. You know, when you talk about a film like Easy Rider, which was made for peanuts, it was made for a few $100,000, and then it grossed like $40 million back in 1969. It showed Hollywood, holy crap, there was this whole market, this whole demographic of young people who are tired of the way their parents did things and are seeking radical change in culture, and who are dropping acid and rejecting the establishment. Those people still buy movie tickets, and they bought a hell of a lot of them when Easy Rider came out. And Hollywood's always been like a big dumb animal. It goes where the food is, it sort of lumbers along and it's doing its thing for a while. And then something new appears, something smells good over there, and they eat that. And then they do that for a while, and then they lumber around, and the cycle repeats itself. And
are there any more Stanley Kubricks? Are there any more Martin Scorsese's? Are there any?
Not right now. There are some very talented filmmakers out there. Don't get me wrong. This era, it does not have a dearth of a lack of powerful filmmakers. But what we're talking about in terms of wanting a paradigm shift to occur, there's no one on that level right now. Like, the last person like that was Quentin Tarantino, who for whatever reason captured the imagination of Generation X, which was kind of a pissed off generation that I was a part of. Before that,
are there still avenues for a young virgin filmmaker like that to explore? I mean, with everything going to streaming services like Netflix and Hulu, et cetera, does that make it easier or harder for them to break in or break out?
I think it's probably easier these days to break in because, as you said, there are new avenues. There's also new technologies that didn't exist, like, say, in the early 1990s when I first came out to Hollywood. To make a movie, you had to use a movie camera, and the rentals were expensive, and film stock was expensive, and everything, even though we mentioned that the price of filmmaking has gone up exponentially on a studio level, that's really because of unions and rentals now. But back then, to just make a film at all was comparatively expensive compared to today, where people are literally shooting feature films on their iPhone. This has an HD quality camera in it that the output of can be sweetened enough so that you can actually project it and it'll look fairly decent on a movie screen. You didn't have that 30 years ago. And what kids are doing now, there's, like I said, there's no deficit of talented people with imaginations out there. They're just making their own little movies on their iPhones and their video cameras, what have you. And they're going to festivals with these things. And yes, they are getting work. There just hasn't been, and the same is true really right now for music. The last paradigm shifting musician in popular music, if you ask me, I'm going to go with Kurt Cobain. I mean, rock and roll was headed in one direction, and then Kurt came along, and suddenly, Poison and Motley Crue and all those bands couldn't, get a gig because all anybody wanted was Kurt Cobain, Nirvana, grunge. There hasn't been anything like that in movies really since Pulp Fiction. I think that Pulp Fiction really blew a generation's mind, even though personally I think Reservoir Dogs is my personal favorite of his films.
We could have a whole podcast just on that.
Oh sure. But back in the 70s, to get back to our original point, the late 60s, early 70s, you had a whole host of new young filmmakers who were influenced by the French New Wave of filmmakers in the 50s and early 60s, people like Francois Truffaut, Jean-Luc Godard, Fellini, Antonioni. Those filmmakers turned on the people, the American filmmakers who were at that time kids or young people. And then when those American kids started getting chances to make movies, they incorporated a decidedly non-Hollywood way of making movies. And the people I'm talking about in particular, you had Francis Ford Coppola, you had Martin Scorsese, Steven Spielberg, John Milius, George Lucas. The list of the talent at that time was shocking, in terms of their gravitas and their really legacy of changing Hollywood. I think about Taxi Driver for a minute. I know we're supposed to be talking about James Bond, but to put a cap on this idea, Taxi Driver, for those of you out there who might not have seen Taxi Driver, was Martin Scorsese's, I think it was his 4th or 5th feature film. He had only been met with limited prior success with Alice Doesn't Live Here Anymore, which most people know because it was the basis for the television show Alice, about the waitresses in Mel's Diner in Phoenix.
Was Raging Bull after?
That was after Taxi Driver. Yeah, Taxi Driver came out. It was produced in 1975, and it either came out in late 75 or early 76. And it's a story about an ex-Vietnam. He's a Vietnam vet, comes back to New York City. He's got serious mental problems where he can't sleep. He's got rage in him towards all sorts of people that he sees as vile, immoral people on the streets of New York City where he lives. And he roams around New York City at night, driving a taxi cab, and interacts with junkies and prostitutes. It's a dark, dark film. And in the end, he tries to assassinate a guy running for Senate, US Senate, and then murders a pimp to rescue one of his prostitutes that he's sort of taken a fatherly figure towards, who was played by Jodie Foster, the prostitute. And that's the end of the movie. He murders, he attempts to murder a senator and then successfully murders a pimp. And the last 5 minutes of the movie is a bloodbath like no one had ever seen before in movies, with literally buckets of blood, people's hands getting blown off, all sorts of things. And it was just this dark, dark anti-hero driven film. You could not get Taxi Driver made today. I've said this 100 times to anybody who would listen to me. That style of filmmaking, although sort of deviant in that it was so dark, there's just no outlet for that today. I mean, maybe Netflix would take a gamble on something that dark. But really, I mean, Taxi Driver is one of the greatest quintessential American films of the 1970s that you couldn't find in a studio to produce today, for sure.
It's fantastic. And I guess just to come full circle on the whole Bond thing, I guess that's the reason why, the Bond franchise has kind of stood the test of time, even given, everything that we're talking about now. And it's because they're using a formula that goes back to the 60s.
And there's that, and the fact, a lot of people don't know this, but the James Bond franchise is the single highest grossing franchise of films in history. It's the longest running franchise in terms of the number of films.
Wow.
Yeah, nothing has even come close to James Bond in terms of overall box office take.
Well, they're fantastic. I know. I was talking to you a little bit before we started recording, and we wanted to go over some of the history of just Bond in general, because it has such, like those movies that you were just mentioning, the Bond franchise, James Bond in general, the books, everything has had such a vast impact on society that I think a lot of people don't even realize. He's such an icon, and so let's spend a little bit of time talking about the history of James Bond.
Sure. James Bond, as most of you out there know, but it behooves mentioning, was based on a series of books written by an Englishman named Ian Flemming. who was an expatriate. He had left England and lived in Jamaica. And he was a former himself. Stories vary, but most people agree he was either associated with or himself involved in the British Secret Service during World War II. He certainly surrounded himself with a great number of people who were most definitely Secret Service agents. And after the war, he decided to write fictionalized novels based on some of the aspects he had witnessed during World War II, with these people, such things including gadgets, that we all know is a core element of James Bond films, spy versus spy type stories. And he encapsulated all the real life people he knew and aspects of their characters into one character, James Bond, who it must be said, is one of the most iconic characters in movie history. But it came from this series of books. And interestingly, the James Bond series of books, which started coming out in the 1950s, were not very popular. Most people had never heard of Ian Fleming or the character James Bond until a very unusual thing happened. It was either during the campaign for president of the United States for the 1960 election, or I can't quite remember my history, or it was after John F. Kennedy actually won that election, that he did an interview and a journalist asked him, what sort of stuff does he read? And I think they were anticipating an answer like, I just read, Abraham Lincoln's biography or something like that. And Kennedy was just really honest. And he said, there's this English writer named Ian Fleming, and he does these incredible spy novels with this character, James Bond. And once a glowing a public that had deeply embraced Kennedy as this youthful guy who would change the world for the better, got wind of that. Ian Fleming novels started selling like hotcakes. And very soon after that, a movie producer by the name of Albert Broccoli, or Broccoli, I believe it's pronounced, and his partner Saltzman, I think is it George Saltzman, I think, bought the film rights from Ian Fleming to produce movies based on the novels. And interestingly, the very first James Bond movies, there was a television version that was done by the BBC, I think, of Casino Royale.
Really?
It was like a short black and white television version aired on the BBC. That was actually, I think, before Broccoli and Saltzman got a hold of the rights. And there was also a version of Casino Royale done with Woody Allen and David Niven and Peter Sellers. You can rent it. Look for the original Casino Royale in the early 1960s. Wow. And that was turned into a slapstick comedy. And it's awful, but has some very, very interesting filmmaking elements to it. One of which, the use of what's known as Dutch angles, where the camera is tilted in a lot of shots to give everything an eerie or sinister feel. On my senior film, student film at NYU, I had recently seen Casino Royale, this version of Casino Royale, and basically stole the idea of using Dutch angles throughout my film. But basically, Broccoli and Saltzman secured the rights to the entire catalog of Fleming novels. And the first one they produced in 1962 was Dr. No. And Dr. No, for me, is still my favorite James Bond film. It's the one that's closest to the feel of Flemming's novels. It wasn't full of gadgets, and it wasn't over the top as a lot of Bond films got later in the catalog. And it stayed very true in a lot of respects to the source material, whereas oftentimes later on, the movies themselves would have no bearing on the content of the original novels beyond the title. Dr. No was the closest to Fleming's spirit, and it of course made Sean Connery into a worldwide superstar. And that's where it all began, 1962, really.
It's funny that you mentioned how they made that. I didn't know that about the whole Woody Allen. But it's funny that you mentioned how it was kind of like a slapstick, because, you know, on the popularity of the Bond franchise in the early days, you started to see kind of like homages, like the whole Matt Helm series, which would be basically the American version of James Bond. Was not exactly slapstick, but it was definitely more humorous than James Bond. So I could see how they could do that.
Yeah, there was actually I've read all the original Fleming novels. I started reading them in college. I had by that time already seen every James Bond film that had been made up to that time, but for some reason I got really interested in that sort of Cold War spy genre. And of course, James Bond, Ian Fleming's James Bond, is the quintessential version of that type of storytelling in a lot of ways. And I can remember reading them and thinking the same thing you did, like these novels were devoid of humor. These were really, James Bond was basically written as an assassin. He wasn't so much a secret agent as he was a guy that the British Secret Service sent out to kill people. And I think out of all the James Bonds, the actors who have portrayed James Bond, the only two that really captured that, of course, Sean Connery, there were moments of humor in the Connery films, but largely he was just a bastard who oftentimes seemingly raped women or forced them into sex and killed people with nary a thought to who he was killing. And also, when they came out with the latest version of Casino Royale with Daniel Craig, they returned. James Bond had gotten so over the top in the Pierce Brosnan era that Broccoli's daughter, Barbara, who now controls the franchise, decided it was time to go back to basics, which is why they hired Daniel Craig, who's, an incredible actor, and wanted him to play it as a psychopath. I mean, that's essentially what James Bond is. He's a psychopath, but he's one that's given a license to kill. And James Bond kind of lost that. It really started in Her Majesty's Secret Service. There was some slapstick elements. And the first two Roger Moore films were pretty cutthroat, Live and Let Die and The Man with the Golden Gun. But by the time you got to The Spy Who Loved Me and Octopussy and films like that, A View to a Kill, it was like, things started getting really kind of over the top with the humor.
Well, in the early days, it's like, okay, you have no humor, and it's probably because they were very close to the writing, like you said. And, British people have a different sense of humor than Americans. So I think, it's like maybe there was some humor, but really the only humor you get from the early days is, at least for me, is like when he does something like really cool, it kind of makes you like chuckle or something because it's like so cool. You know what I mean?
Right. He'd kill someone and then have a deadpan line about, that sort of referred how the guy just died type of thing. Or there was quite a bit of misogynist humor in the early ones, where Bond would bed a woman and then make some quip that referred, and of course the famous female character names in the original Connery, Honey Rider, and everybody's favorite Pussy Galore.
Yeah.
That's very Messiah. You wouldn't get away with that kind of stuff in today's world.
I love, being a 90s kid, by I think it was late 90s or maybe even like very early 2000s. The whole Mike Myers, Austin Powers spoof on the Bond series was fantastic because of all those things.
Yeah.
They called all those things out.
Yeah. And it should be mentioned, with the immediate success of James Bond, I mean, Dr. No was an enormous hit. I think it was the third highest grossing title of 1962. You started seeing a host of imitators, both on TV as well as in films. On TV, you had The Man from U.N.C.L.E. and a host of other spy shows like Peter Gunn and stuff like that. And in the movies, Our Man Flint, there were a host of imitators. So yeah, Mike Myers was very clever. Of course, the main thing he was spoofing was James Bond. There were elements of spoof in the whole genre in that film. It wasn't just James Bond. It was also these other also ran franchises of the early mid 60s.
I guess I have to ask the question. I guess now is a good time. As good time as any. Who's your favorite Bond and why?
To this day, Sean Connery still remains my favorite Bond. I have nothing but good things to say about Daniel Craig, although a couple of his James Bond films weren't the greatest in terms of screenwriting, in terms of direction, storytelling. Nonetheless, his portrayal of James Bond is a favorite of mine. The early Roger Moore films are really, really good. Live and Let Die is a sinister film. Deals with the heroin trade in Harlem and all the peoples whose lives get ruined by the distribution of heroin in Harlem, in New York. That was based on what was really going on in Harlem at the time. You had big gangsters. In fact, one of them was depicted in the movie American Gangster with Denzel Washington. There were guys, Bumpy Johnson was one. I forget everybody's name, but these were real figures. And then Live and Let Die also threw in a voodoo Santeria element in it, which scared the crap out of me as a kid. I saw it for the first time when I was like 10 years old, and all the voodoo stuff kind of freaked me out as a kid. The first Bond film that I ever saw was actually a Roger Moore film. It was The Man with the Golden Gun, which came out in 1974. And my mom for some unknown reason, took me to see it as I was 4 years old. And she took me to see a James Bond film. And I loved it, though. I was a pretty sophisticated, weird little kid. And I loved it. So I have an appreciation for Roger Moore, even though later on his portrayal got pretty silly. The ones I didn't like, I did not care for Timothy Dalton. I didn't feel he had the look or the charisma for the role. George Lazenby, as Bond, he didn't do well in Her Majesty's Secret Service, and in fact is the only James Bond portrayer who only got to do one film. But on Her Majesty's Secret Service is a really, really good film. It's one of the better Bond films ever made. The ending of which was tragic, and he finally gets married to a girl portrayed by the gorgeous Diana Rigg, who appeared in the Avengers series in England, and she gets murdered at the end of the film by Blofeld. And
if you had to break down like the Bond
In order?
by era, like what time frame? So it started in '62 was the first one with Sean Connery. How long did his reign as Bond last?
He did Dr. No. He did Goldfinger, of course, which was the highest grossing Bond film in the early years. He did You Only Live Twice. He did From Russia with Love, and then got really tired of portraying James Bond, left the franchise, which is when George Lazenby stepped in to do On Her Majesty's Secret Service, which, by the way, I always wished Sean Connery had done that film because it was such a good movie. And with Connery as Bond, that just would have been one of the all-time great Bond films. But then they, because Lazenby wasn't accepted by audiences and was kind of a box office failure, the Broccoli family just threw a pile of money at Sean Connery to get him to come back, which he did for one more film, which was Diamonds Are Forever. Then you had Roger Moore stepped in to play the role first, as I said, with Live and Let Die. Then Man with the Golden Gun, Spy Who Loved Me, and he continued on to do For Your Eyes Only, Moonraker, View to a Kill, Octopussy, so on and so forth. And by the time Roger Moore was done, he was in his late 60s, and he was starting to look to be a little too old to be running around screwing 18-year-old girls and blowing everything up. So they went in a new direction, which was Timothy Dalton, which I just didn't get, who I believe only did 2 films, the names of which are going to escape me. Was it License to Kill was one of them, and I can't remember the next one. But in any event, he didn't last very long because audiences like me didn't really care for him as Bond. They went.
Maybe this was like in the '80s.
What? I'm sorry, you broke up a little bit. What'd you say?
This was around like the '80s.
Yeah, the late 80s. I think his 2 movies were like in 87, 89, maybe. Or maybe it was later than that. I forget.
Because Brosnan came in next in the '90s, right?
Yeah, and Brosnan was someone that Broccoli had his eye on for many, many years to portray James Bond, and had actually made overtures. He was supposed to take over from Roger Moore, but he was contractually still involved with the TV show Remington Steele. And the shooting schedule of which just precluded him from being able to do Bond. So when they announced that finally Pierce Brosnan was going to be James Bond, the information was released with all this hubbub, and people were real excited. And then the movie came out. I believe the first one was GoldenEye. And it was just a horrible, horrible, over-the-top film.
How dare you, Rob?
Oh, I hated the Brosnan James Bonds. They were.
What? No.
It was always this.
He's the only Bond I knew, and so I loved Pierce Brosnan as James Bond. To look, this time he was James Bond.
We gravitate towards the things that, you know, how they say the cars that were around when we were kids are the cars we still love the best today, which is why I love, you know, the golden era of muscle cars. That's what I used to see as a kid. Same can be said for movies, my friend. And I think if he was really the first Bond that, you know, when you were, you know, like a teenager or just getting into James Bond, you might have an overinflated sense of how he did. I would argue.
You are 100% correct, because I've gone back and tried to watch those, and they're not good. You compare it to the latest Bond, and Daniel Craig's so much better.
Yeah.
Classic Bond, Sean Connery's so much better.
Yeah, and the Pierce Brosnan one that had Halle Berry in it is just so awful.
Die Another Day.
It actually defies description. I saw it about a year ago for, I think it's only the second time I've seen it. I actually saw that movie in the theater and wanted to walk out, the Ice Palace. And I'm like, what the F is going on here? I mean, this just makes no sense. And it was convoluted.
Okay, so GoldenEye came out, right? And then I think just a couple years later, you had on Nintendo 64 GoldenEye, right? So that was like, for a kid who was very much into Nintendo, that was like the end all be all for video games. So
yeah, I get it.
You had the game, it was awesome.
Yeah. And look, Brosnan himself, I'm not suggesting Brosnan didn't do a good job. He was Pierce Brosnan. I mean, he's like was one of the most handsome men on the planet, according to every woman you ever talked to. And he had the charm and the charisma, and he looked good in a tuxedo. He did fine. It was just the movies themselves, the scripting, the ideas. They were running out of ideas, So it was kind of like Fast and the Furious, where you progress from a very simple, grounded, reality-based story. And by the time you're at Fast and the Furious 9, it's just nonsense. That's kind of where we got when we got to Pierce Brosnan.
For sure.
And I think I mentioned earlier when Brosnan was through and they hired Daniel Craig, I think Brosnan did not go willingly. He did not, like Sean Connery, say, I'm done with this, time to move on. Barbara Broccoli was the one who said we need to go in a different direction, because she recognized the films were just getting dumb. And she wanted to go back to basics, a sardonic, psychopathic killer. Well, and that's what they got in Daniel Craig. So those are the basic eras. You had Connery in the 60s, Roger Moore in the 70s and 80s, Timothy Dalton in the late 80s, Pierce Brosnan in the 90s, and then with George Lazenby squeezed in there in 1969 on Her Majesty's Secret Service, and then Daniel Craig in the new millennium.
Yeah. I really love the Craig era. Casino Royale was like a game changer. When it came out, at first I was like, what is this, man? This is not anything like the Bond I know. He's brash, he's like not smooth and suave like we're used to, and not in the same way anyways.
Right.
And, he seemed more like an American Bond, if that makes any sense, right? Like he was like very gruff.
And not as polished. And there's the immortal line. I mean, a vodka martini, shaken not stirred. Yeah. I believe it was in Casino Royale. He's at the baccarat table or whatever game, poker or whatever they were playing, and a waitress comes up to him and says, can I get you a cocktail? And he goes, vodka martini. And she goes, shaken or not stirred or stirred. And he looks at her and he goes, do I look like I give a shit?
Yeah.
So they got away from the, sophisticated quips of a guy who can tell the difference between a shaken or a stirred martini to a guy who doesn't give a crap. He's a killer. He just wants his booze. And
cars, I mean, he pulls up, I think in Casino Royale, he pulls up in like a Ford Taurus or something.
I don't remember, but of course, after the point where Q gets a hold of him, he
wins the Aston in a card game.
Oh, that's right. He goes to, where was it, Jamaica in the beginning, or some island where they have a casino, and he beats his nemesis out of a DB5, wasn't it originally? Yeah. But later in the film, when they go to the casino, for that portion of the film, I believe parked in the hotel's parking lot, he has a DBS, I believe, right?
Yeah. So he has DBS, like the newer version, and it's awesome. It's a great movie. If you haven't seen it, audience at home, go watch it. Fantastic.
Yeah, Casino Royale is really my favorite of the Daniel Craig films, but not by much, because this new one, which we should talk about now, is a heck of a film. Do you want to launch into it? Do we want to take a quick break or?
Yeah, we can launch into, I just real quick before we get into the actual, like that particular movie, I do want to talk about, like some of the aspects of the Bond film that have created ripples throughout like society, right? Like from the watch he wears to the suits and tuxedos he wears to the cars he drives. James Bond is important for all those reasons, right? Like everything that he has and does, all his from his gadgets to just like the clothes that he wears.
Yeah.
People want them, and so that's why we're sitting here talking about them right now, because all those elements are present in the latest movie. So from a filmmaker standpoint, Rob, how does that, like, if you were working on a Bond film, do you know, like, okay, so that's something that I get to play with, or is that every film? Like when you're talking about like set or clothing design or
well, when I was in film school, there was a theory held by a small group of filmmakers. This is dating back to the 40s and 50s and so forth. There was a certain breed of filmmaker who either they themselves or the critics, film critics, labeled them with the French word auteur, which means author. And what was meant by the title auteur was that these were select directors that were so involved with every aspect of their films. They were so compelled to control and micromanage every aspect of the film that the critics and indeed maybe the filmmakers themselves felt as if they were the author of this material, just like an author writes a book. No one else controls that, what goes into that book really, except the author. You have editors, but the editors are there to make suggestions, clean up language. The rule of thumb is when you're dealing with authors of books, an editor does not significantly mess with the writer's style or content. They make suggestions, but the ultimate author is the author. And a couple of names I can throw at you, or three names I'd throw at you in terms of auteur filmmakers of this era that we're talking about. Alfred Hitchcock was considered an auteur. Elia Kazan was considered an auteur. And John Ford, who was famous for Westerns, like the John Wayne Westerns and films. Did he do High Noon? I can't remember. He did Stagecoach and he did My Darling Clementine. He might have done High Noon. I can't remember. But these were guys. John Ford was such a control freak. This is very interesting. Hollywood filmmaking, since its earliest years, has always involved a process where the director will first shoot what's known as a master shot, which is typically a wide angle shot that includes everything in the scene, the actors, the background, everything in one wide shot. And then he is free to choose what angles to repeat that scene, like do the scene over, but in close-ups, or in what's called a two shot, which is a shot of two actors talking to each other or interacting. And then all of that footage gets given to an editor who then decides when to cut away from the master shot into a close-up or an extreme close-up, or cut away, cut back to the scene. That was an editor's job. That wasn't a director's job. A director's job was to direct the actors, block out the scene in terms of what lens to use, what distance from the characters, and how the camera might move within the world. And that was it. John Ford was so bright, he was such a genius, that he could pre-envision every single shot. he wanted in a film. He knew on what line he wanted the picture to cut from a wide shot to an insert shot, a close-up, what have you. And because he didn't want, because he was a control freak, he didn't want an editor making those decisions. So basically, he would only shoot what he wanted to appear in the final film. Now, the risk involved in that is just incredible, because the reason why you do a master shot and then repeat takes from different angles is because sometimes you get in the editing room and you discover, wow, the scene is dragging. You know, it's just like too dialogue intensive. It's going on forever. We can shorten it by cutting away here, going to a close-up that was supposed to be later in the scene. And in that way, we can cut out a chunk of dialogue, let's say, and make the scene shorter. John Ford didn't want, as I said, to cede control. So he would often on set only shoot the master shot until a particular line where he had pre-envisioned we should cut. Then he, instead of shooting the whole scene over from the angle he wanted to cut to, he would just pick up on the last line from the master shot. So there was literally nothing for an editor to cut with. The editor had to cut away from the master to the insert shot the way John Ford shot it. I don't know of any other director in history who was bright enough to do that, ballsy enough to do that, or certainly these days would be given that much creative control to do something like that. He was certainly an auteur. After that, of course, you had Stanley Kubrick, who was always given final cut on his films, and a couple of other people, Michael Cimino, who directed The Deer Hunter, which is one of my favorite films of all time. He was, after that film swept the Academy Awards and was considered an American classic, he was given final cut on his next film, which was called Heaven's Gate, which was such a disaster that it nearly sunk United Artists Studios. It went so massively over budget and was such a disaster that the studio was almost bankrupted by it. And in fact, the seminal book about Michael Cimino's disaster of Heaven's Gate was a book called Final Cut, because it was deemed that the big mistake was to give this guy final cut just because The Deer Hunter was such a great film. And by final cut, I mean he was given full creative control. He could do whatever he wanted without interference, legal. You know, he had a legal contract that said no one can touch anything on this film except Michael Cimino, which in a de facto way, that agreement made him an auteur of Heaven's Gate. That's not done anymore. I mean, I think maybe Quentin Tarantino is given pretty loose license. I think maybe David Fincher is given pretty free rein, but no one to the degree of the filmmakers I mentioned before. And the reason why I bring all of this up is your original point was, like, to what degree do you involve yourself in the details of a film? For me, I was always impressed by the notion of an auteur. And in my own work, I always wanted to have as much control as I could, but at the same time, delegating jobs, because you can't focus on everything as a director of a film. It's just, for me, I found it impossible. But I would sit down with the art director and I would assemble little videotapes where I cut scenes from other films that had a look that I was after, or sometimes I would have a director of photography and I would send him a videotape of clips from movies with lighting and lens choice that, and I would just write him a note saying, this is what we're doing, watch this tape. And a good cinematographer can watch a tape and go, I know exactly what Rob's after. But that would be the extent of my authorship. I wouldn't actually get behind the camera because I wasn't a cameraman. You know, that's not where my talent lay. My talent lay in conceptualizing things and how it should look.
The reason I ask is because you know, it's through that things become iconic, right? Like, so some people might say, like, well, who cares really about the minutia of, you know, whether or not James Bond wears a Tom Ford suit or a Gucci tuxedo. But if someone wasn't making those decisions and someone wasn't like so careful with their choices, then the Rolex Submariner that you know,
Sean Connery and
Connery wears
more,
in the very first one, then the Rolex might not be as iconic as it is today. I think it probably still would be, but
it would be iconic. But if you type in Rolex Submariner on Google, after the first 10 articles, which are people selling them or the Rolex website, I guarantee you on the first or second page, you're going to get a James Bond reference in a Google search. Likewise with Aston Martin, you say Aston Martin, people say James Bond. And
no other car or brand is so closely tied to something like that. I can't think of another example of like when you say Aston Martin, like, sure, you know, there are fans of the car, you know, but my mind immediately I envision James Bond when I think Aston Martin.
Well, everybody does. I mean, you know, you and I are in a league of car nut that's kind of elite in the sense that not only do you and I just think about cars all day because we're freaks, but we also work in, you know, an offshoot of the car industry where we cover cars for a living. Yeah, and even so, you say to me, Aston Martin, well, you know, Aston Martin races in Formula One right now, and they race at Le Mans, and they do all sorts of things, and they have new models coming out all the time. That's not the first thing I think of when you say Aston Martin. I think of that silver DB5 with Sean Connery behind the wheel and you know, in Goldfinger. And Thunderball. Oh, we forgot to talk about Thunderball. That was one of Connery's original films. But you know, Flemming's novels had a lot of little spy gadgets in it, like guns disguised in briefcases and stuff like that. They were actually very reality-based gadgets, things that the British Secret Service and the American OSS, which was the precursor of the CIA, actually developed for their agents and spies. The movies, however, you know, took it to another level. No one actually ever drove a car that had machine guns under the headlights and ejector seats and stuff like that.
That we know of.
That we know. I can pretty much assure you, though, you know. But yeah, I mean, Aston Martin is so closely linked to the franchise, even though they went away from Aston Martin for a few films and went with Lotus for Spy Who Loved Me and For Your Eyes Only.
And as well. He was in Beamers. He was in BMWs.
Yeah, for a while. I mean, but that was a crass, like, commercial arrangement. Ian Fleming's, the early James Bond films, the reason why James Bond drove an Aston Martin was because it was the highest performance British car made. And it was felt quite correctly that, you know, the British Secret Service, if they were going to build a supercar for one of their agents, it would be a British car. It wouldn't be a German car, but, you know, I'm sure BMW paid a lot of money in the Brosnan films to get those Beamers in there. But yeah, personally, yeah, as a director in the past, I like to pick, I used to pick my own locations. I would be very involved in wardrobe. And as I said, the cinematography and the art direction. Every director is different, though. Some directors just follow the adage that if you hire enough talented people around you, just let them do their jobs and they'll get it right. I always found my level of control freakness required me to be a bit more hands-on. And then there's the extreme, like I mentioned, John Ford, Stanley Kubrick, Alfred Hitchcock. Kubrick used to, he, like in The Shining, all the, Danny's little stuffed animals and stuff like that. Kubrick picked each one by hand.
Wow. Okay.
There's a wonderful documentary. It was on Netflix at one point called Room 237, which goes in depth about the secret meanings behind The Shining. I urge you all, if you're Stanley Kubrick fans, he's my favorite filmmaker of all time, to watch Room 237. And it gets into how Kubrick picked every single wardrobe choice in that film, every color of every piece of furniture. I mean, it was just like crazy what he was involved in. But I mean, the James Bond franchise, you're right. I mean, it launched so many things that are iconic, between Aston Martins, Rolex Submariners, the suits he wore, the
whole Daniel Craig, the Craig era. They've been fond of using Tom Ford suits. He doesn't wear a Rolex. He wears an Omega.
Right. That's another commercial tie-in, though. These days.
They probably give a boatload of money to get him to wear a Seamaster or whatever.
Sure.
But yeah, I like all those little things about them.
Absolutely. But I'm glad they got them to the right level now. It was getting pretty crazy in like the Brosnan, even in the Roger Moore era. Like the gadgets were getting kind of silly at certain points, and now they've brought them to plausibility mostly. Which I kind of dig. And that's in keeping with how they wanted to get back to basics with Bond as a character, with the hiring of Daniel Craig and writing Bond more as the original psychopath that he was in the Flemming novels.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
I dig it, man. One thing that we didn't talk about that was like also like iconically Bond is his use of Walther firearms. So I think even now, like, yeah, he has the what is it, the PPK.
PPK.
In the latest movie, he uses a PPK, but he also has a PPQ, which is like their like Walther like full polymer frame.
Polymer. Yeah. In Fleming's novels, actually, the PPK was not the gun of choice. Bond used a 25 caliber Beretta.
Really? Okay.
In Fleming's novels. And in the first Dr. No movie, the very first scene that we ever meet M and Q, well, it's before Q, the character is not even referred to as Q. He goes into M's office when M gives him his mission to go to Jamaica and find out what happened to their agent Strangways, who's disappeared on Jamaica. M says, "Can you please remove your weapon out of the holster?" And Bond takes out his 25 caliber Beretta, and M looks at it and basically dismisses it as an underpowered, weapon. And he calls for the armorer, I think the guy is referred to as in Dr. No, to come in. And the guy gives him a Walther PPK. And in a very strange bit of dialogue, because a PPK is a 380 caliber, it's not a very powerful round. It's basically a short 9mm. The armorer opens a wood case and says, "This is your new weapon. It's a Walther PPK. It fires 7 shots in the clip, 1 in the chamber, and has a delivery like a brick through a plate glass window." I was like, well, what does that mean, a delivery? Like, if you know anything about guns, it's, caliber by velocity is basically the physics of what a cartridge does. And this little 380 has a delivery like a,
Well, maybe for the time, maybe for the time.
It's very naive and kind of, right for the time. But in some of the Brosnan films, I think they had him using polymer Walthers. I think he was using a P99, which was the first Walther Glock-like hybrid polymer pistol, but now they've gone back to the roots with the PPK. He's also, Daniel Craig at times has used a host of longer weapons, Heckler and Koch machine guns at times. I think he was using
416 in the last one and this one.
Yeah.
A SIG P226 in this one.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the Bond movies have tons of firearms, and that's what I really love them. But I like that they kept the PPK, even though it's like, maybe just his sidearm or maybe some when he's doing some quiet wet work.
I mean, in today's world of advanced computer designed firearms and polymers and the technology of weapons now is such that like a Walther PPK is a dinosaur. It was a World War II gun. Can you think of any cop or agent who carries a PPK now? It'd be like carrying something from the Stone Age or something. And it's quaint, but and appropriate. To keep it to the basics, so to speak.
Let's talk about the new movie, Rob. Let's talk about some of the cars in the movie. Let's talk about the plot. Let's talk about the things about it and the things that you didn't like about it. Let's talk about it.
Yeah, the newest one is No Time to Die. It marks the very last film that Daniel Craig is going to do as James Bond. And I think at this point, we should reiterate that there are spoilers coming.
Yep.
I'm going to give you a big one right now. At the end of this movie, James Bond dies. And
you anticipate that? I mean, I did. I felt like
that's how I interpreted it. And what I was thinking at the end of the film was one of two things is going to happen in the next James Bond film, which there inevitably will be one with a new actor, is either somehow, he escaped death by missile at the end, and they'll pick up the next movie where, in the exact moment that this one leaves off and they show him jumping in the water or escaping somehow. Or the future of James Bond, maybe they go into retro films. And I thought that might be really interesting. Like they go back and they show us missions that James Bond did in the 70s or the 60s. And maybe some of the films are, art directed as period pieces. That would be pretty cool. But ultimately, I mean, that's how I interpret it. James Bond dies.
Yeah.
And he lives on through the discovery that he has a child.
Yeah.
I forget the character's name, but the blonde girl in this film, I
thought she did a fantastic job, by the way.
A really pretty girl, and she is now the only, you can look up the actress's name. She's, I believe, French or French Canadian, maybe.
I've never seen her in anything else.
Well, she was in the last James Bond film. She's the only girl who has ever appeared as the same character in two Bond films.
Really?
Yep. The only other woman who's ever even appeared in two Bond films.
Excuse me.
Well, but I mean, in terms of a James Bond girl,
James Bond
is,
girl, right? Okay.
I think Lois Chiles was in two, wasn't she? Or maybe Jane Seymour. There was only one woman, but she played two different characters. This girl was at the end of the last movie. What was the last movie? Quantum of Solace, or was it Spectre? Yeah. She appears in that, and she's in this one. She's quite good. She's easy on the eyes, certainly. I mean, there was a lot to like in this film. If you want to start off with what I didn't like,
sure.
It was like 2 hours and 45 minutes long.
Long film.
And although the film kept moving, it didn't exactly drag at any point. I was aware of the fact that I was sitting in a theater for a very long time. I actually, for all you out there, Vinny was cool enough to get me into the West Coast press screening of the film.
That was cool. Actually, yeah. Tell us about your experience, because I haven't even heard Oh,
Yeah, originally Vinny got invited to the press screening of the film, which was before a good week before the film's theatrical release. It was actually before the world premiere, which took place in London. So I was amongst one of the first people on the planet to see the film. Vinny couldn't go, and he was kind enough to send me as his emissary. And it was down it was in San Diego, actually. It wasn't in Los Angeles. And I got up bright and early to beat traffic. And
what time was the showing?
I think it was on at noon or 12:30. And there were COVID protocols. And
big theater? What?
It was actually in, I guess you would qualify it as a stadium almost. Like, I'm not sure what... like a really big amphitheater that was big enough for like basketball courts or a hockey rink. I forget what the name of the place was, but it was a big auditorium, which was necessary because of COVID protocols. They wanted people spaced out. And it was the first movie I've gone to since the pandemic, but you know, I had a little trepidation going in. I haven't spent a lot of time in an enclosed space with a lot of people in a while because my personal views on safety. And but I got over it, and I got into the film very quickly. It jumps right in to the story. I didn't like how long it was, and you know, as I said, the story didn't drag, and it was a very large story. So what they did with that screenplay or that story sort of necessitated a film of that length. But I felt you could have told just as good a story without so many characters and machinations. It was a very complex narrative. Like, I could give you a log line right now about what happened in the movie, but I couldn't tell you all the subplots. There was so much going on.
Okay, there was a lot going on. There was almost two villains that he was dealing with.
Yeah, basically. Yeah.
And so, yeah, there was a lot going on. And any film where I go to the theater, when I have to use the restroom in the middle, it pisses me off, man. Like,
absolutely, because in a film that dense, there's no good time to walk out of the screening because you're going to miss something that's probably critical to the story. I felt, I would be critical of the fact to a degree that I thought there was almost too much going on. I could have reduced the number of subplots maybe. But I think I got the impression that Daniel Craig and the filmmakers wanted this to be an opportunity to send him off. He's been a very popular James Bond. I don't know of anybody who doesn't like Daniel Craig as James Bond. And I think they needed to tie up all the loose ends of the Spectre elements of the Daniel Craig era. Like, basically, unlike previous James Bond movies, like from the 60s, 70s, 80s, where each movie was a totally separate story with a separate villain usually, and all that, the Daniel Craig era has really just been one long film that started with Casino Royale, ending with Vesper Lynd's death and his desire to find the people responsible for turning her against him. He's become obsessed. And upon discovering Spectre is involved in it, and Christoph Waltz, who in the past films played Blofeld, who was fantastic. And now you got Rami Malek, who hopefully everybody saw as Freddie Mercury in the movie about Queen, which was a fantastic performance and a really good film. You've got more than one villain now in this movie. And I kind of was like, okay, like, who am I supposed to hate?
Yeah.
You know, traditional storytelling has archetypes in it, and there's usually one villain, and then you have the villain's henchman, and then you have a character who seems like an ally through most of the film, but turns at the end. That archetype is known as a shapeshifter. To give an example of this, I mean, the iconic villain in Star Wars is Darth Vader, but he always has a minion that's helping him, whether it's the Emperor, who's a lesser character, or Grand Moff Tarkin, who was like the commander of the Death Star.
Right.
There's only one villain, and I kind of could critique this as having more than one villain.
Right.
Basically, I mean, the story is that I believe he's Finnish scientist or a British scientist has developed a biological weapon which is actually mechanical. Instead of being a virus or a bacteria, it's what's known as nanobots, which are microscopic little robots that have computer chips on board. They are able to detect a person's DNA and create a virus that then replicates based on a person's DNA. And the secret in that is that you can design a virus that'll only kill one person on the planet and leave, even if other people are infected, unless it's programmed for your DNA or programmed to interpret your DNA, you won't get sick from it, which is kind of a far-fetched idea. But in the world of COVID and you know, we had an example of biological terrorism after 9/11 with the anthrax attacks. We had a war in Iraq that was allegedly about, you know, weapons of mass destruction. It's a timely subject, but you know, the element of this is actually a robot and not, you know, a nanobot and not a true biological virus. I had to swallow that, you know, kind of begrudgingly.
What about
But anyway, that scientist is kidnapped by bad guys.
Yeah.
And James Bond's initial mission is to locate the guy. And then it kind of got confusing because the guy keeps changing hands, like he's abducted by Spectre, and then he's abducted by Rami Malek, who, even though he's a criminal, he hates Spectre. There was like a lot in it, and you really had to pay attention. In the end, I mean, it was good storytelling with the satisfying resolution. And everything made sense. It was just really dense and long. Those would be my main two critiques of the film.
what about any like corniness? Like there was one part in the film when the new 007 requests that the 007 moniker be given back to James Bond because they didn't even really address why. They just, I guess.
No, I interpreted that as, you know, he's as famous within the British Secret Service as he is to us. Like, he's legendary.
Okay.
And she felt James Bond is initially replaced as 007 by a woman now. I think her character was called Naomi or something.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, that didn't bother me so much. I did find that in a couple of instances, especially action sequences, they got a little over the top above where the Daniel Craig movies have been, but nothing that made me cringe.
Yeah.
And, you know, he plays it as sardonic as ever. Like, he's a killer. He kills a lot of people in this movie and doesn't give a rat's ass about any of them, which I liked.
Yeah. So things I loved about the movie, other than like the style that we've talked about already, the wardrobe stuff, I thought was really cool. I always like that in Bond movies. So the action, but not just like to get specific with the action. There's an awesome motorcycle scene.
Yes, there is.
Love when there's motorcycle scenes in Bond movies, and so far Daniel Craig has had 3 three really great motorcycle chase scenes.
Wow, you know more about that than I do. I'm a motorcycle guy too. Like I love motorcycles. I don't own one. I've got a bad back and I've had a fusion in my spine, so I no longer can entertain the idea of motorcycles. But you're really a nut about them and do ride, so you know more about that than I do.
Cyclists, I love it. So I always notice when they're in films, and since he's always in like a interesting location, the motorcycle choices are I appreciate them, right? So the first one was in Casino Royale, and in fact he rides one like on a crane or something. Like I don't know if you remember that. It's kind of
In the opening where he's chasing that guy.
yeah.
Yeah.
And the last one, so not Quantum of Solace, but I guess it would have been Spectre. He's some Latin country, I can't remember where, but there's a guy, an assassin on a dirt bike, and James Bond steals it from him, and yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And then of course this one, and I want to say it's a Triumph. I haven't actually looked it up to see what kind of motorcycle it is. But
I don't. That's a good question. I'm not sure. It certainly was not. You know, a lot of times in movies like Mission Impossible and The Matrix, where there's big motorcycle chases, they always go, and hey, I mean, it's one of my favorite brands of motorcycles in the world, but they always go for the Ducati, you know, the Hyper Ducati at the time. I think in The Matrix, it was like a 996 or a 998. And then in what was the other film I just mentioned? Matrix and Mission Impossible. I think Tom Cruise was on a Ducati Monster in one of the films. But yeah, I would have to look up what this bike was. But my guess it would be a Triumph, because that's really the only big English brand that's left.
Triumph.
You know, Norton is, as far as I know, no longer, and Indian is no longer. BSA, none of those bikes exist, right?
Indian is still around. They got a revamp. They make some awesome motorcycles. For me, I'm a Harley guy, so I'll probably I'm an Indian. But I was right. He does ride a very cool scrambler style
Triumph
in No Time to Die. And it's really cool from the very beginning.
Yeah, Scrambler is a variation of one of my favorite bikes in the world, and they still make them. Triumph still makes Bonnevilles, and Bonnevilles are just old school cool. They're not fast bikes. They're like 750s or what have you, and you know, they're putt bikes, but they got that Fonzie, James Dean feel to them still, where they look exactly like the Triumphs from the 60s and 70s, which are amongst the coolest bikes ever made. And yet the modern ones are actually reliable now. You could never keep a vintage Triumph running for very long, but now they're quality bikes. So
second, kind of cool. You know, basically you can bet money on this, right? Anything Steve McQueen ever rode, drove, wore, said, did is cool.
The coolest thing ever. He had a Jaguar D-Type. He had a Triumph. Yeah, I mean, you nailed that. The iconic, you know, 68 Mustang, the Bullet Mustang, and yeah, absolutely. But the things he personally owned, he was a big fan of Triumph in his real life. As well as Jaguar. And just recently, actually, on a tangent, I was at the Peterson Automotive Museum about a month ago or so ago, because they had a Formula One exhibit there with a lot of Senna's cars and Michael Schumacher's Formula One cars. And they had Steve McQueen's Jaguar D-Type on display. Got to be one of the sexiest cars ever made. I know, it's like the most beautiful woman you ever saw in your life. It's just curves and humps in all the right places.
You talk about the Coke bottle chargers and stuff. No, that thing is a Coke.
No. I urge everybody, if you don't know what we're talking about, look up a Jaguar D-Type and do it in British Racing Green, which is what Steve McQueen's is in, and it's just unbelievable.
So the Peterson when they had the Bond exhibit.
I did not. I did not see the Bond exhibit. It wasn't that long ago, was it?
No, I think they just launched the new Bond exhibit there.
Oh, well, maybe I should go back. I thought it was in and out for the like the summer months or something. They had it. I don't remember.
Well, that brings us to the cars of Bond, right? So
Absolutely.
so in this movie, so we talked about the motorcycle, which is awesome, but outside of the motorcycle, there's some awesome cars in this movie.
There are, and of course, Aston Martin features most prominently. And they did something really cool in this being Daniel Craig's last chapter as James Bond. I think they decided to send Bond off, so to speak, if in fact he is supposed to have been killed at the end of this film, by having him drive every Aston Martin or be seen next to, I should say also, because at least one of them isn't driven. Every Aston Martin that's appeared in a Bond film over the decades, as well as including one of Aston Martin's latest hypercars. So, of course, in the film, there's the iconic DB5 in silver, which James Bond's first Aston Martin with Sean Connery that appeared in Thunderball, Goldfinger. I think those were the only two original Connery films that it appeared in. It wasn't. Maybe it was a brief appearance in From Russia with Love or You Only Live Twice, but basically it premiered heavily in Goldfinger, which it's most known for, and it was in Thunderball as well. And he drives that. He drives the same model DBS that
Vantage Volare.
Well, there was the one that George Lazenby drove in for Her Majesty's Secret Service, appears in the film, as I recall. And then
I don't know if he drives it.
I can't remember if he actually drove it, but then there's the V8 Vantage from the Timothy Dalton era. There's
share the screen so people can see what we're talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, I saw this movie several weeks ago, so I remember the cars that were in it, but I can't quite remember which ones were driven and which were not. Maybe if you have a better
I do. So
memory of it.
This is the bike that we were talking about just a moment ago, that Triumph. Awesome.
Mm-hmm.
But the cars that we were just talking about. So let's see. So there's the there's the DB5. That was the first one that he drives.
Right. And mind you, the DB5 now has Gatling guns equipped instead of just standard like 30 cal machine guns behind the headlights.
Yeah, and like caltrops that fall out of it. Like
yeah.
So then this is the one.
Correct.
He drives this one. He drives.
Yeah, that's the one from Her Majesty's Secret Service that George Lazenby drove.
Right.
That's the car that his wife dies in at the end.
Okay.
Of Her Majesty's Secret Service. Then this was the car that Timothy Dalton drove in his outings, and this is one of my favorite Aston Martins of all time.
Come on, man, that thing is so cool.
The first one of these I ever saw in my life, I was out on Long Island in the Hamptons as a teenager, and my buddy and I went to this restaurant, and there were one of these in that exact same color, charcoal gray, in the parking lot of this restaurant, and we stood around it and realized that this was the British interpretation of like a Boss 429. Yeah. The front of the car even looks very Mustang. This was an English muscle car. And if you ask me, one of the finest examples of English motoring ever made. There was also a convertible called the Volante.
It's even got a V8. I mean,
come on. It's a V8. It's an American style pushrod V8. Sounds like a V8. Looks like a Mustang. Can't lose there, right?
Crazy. This looks older than a 1985. I love it.
Yeah, well, that car ran for many, many years. That's the car that replaced the DBS that we previously saw and stayed in vogue as Aston Martin's premier car throughout the 80s into the 90s until like the DB7s came out, I think.
What a killer car, man. I love that one.
Love the fog lamps in the grill, like a Shelby Mustang. The whole thing is just unbelievable.
So in No Time to Die, he spends a lot of wheel time.
Yes, he does.
In this one,
Right.
Which I really appreciated.
Yep.
Then you got the Brosnan era.
Correct.
Vanquish with the rockets.
Yeah, it's another one of my favorite Aston Martins of all time, the V12 Vanquish. I saw one of these here in LA not too long ago over the summer. And I think I would probably choose the Vanquish S, which was the sport model that came just after the Vanquish. I would probably choose that over any current Aston Martin. Its looks are just...
Look at the hips on this thing, man.
It's dude, what I would do to own one of these, just one of these cars.
I really do love that one, but I like what came next a little bit more.
Yeah, the DBS and DBS Superleggera featured, they were in Casino Royale and I think Quantum of Solace as well. These are beautiful cars. I never quite fell in love with it as much as that V12 Vanquish, but I'd certainly take one.
This one was the one that was featured prominently this year in No Time to Die. Awesome. Just, I mean, come on. The DBS Superleggera, it's so you follow it makes sense. You look at that one, you look at this one.
Yep.
This.
Yep, they keep the basic proportions and they just change the design language on them, and they do it perfectly from generation to generation. And you know, there are not too many companies like Aston Martin, and it's befitting that all of their cars show a level not only of quality and performance, but also that design language that keeps subtly changing, but you still recognize it at first glance as nothing but an Aston Martin.
The oval angled headlights, you know, that big, I love that wide mouth grille, man.
Yeah.
You know, the mesh style wheels that are kind of like what does Greg call them, asymmetric. Yeah, the low swept roof line, the big haunches in the back, they're fantastic. I love Aston Martins.
Absolutely. So
cool. And so in this movie, he drives this one quite a bit. Like you said, Rob, it has miniguns behind the headlights.
Mm-hmm.
And, so very, very cool. And
and then finally, it's the Valhalla. I don't know if that's on this list.
But you can talk a little bit about that one, Rob.
Yeah, the current or soon to be current Aston Martin hypercar is the Aston Martin Valkyrie, which is basically a Formula One car. It's a detuned version, somewhat different from the current Aston Martin, the engine that Aston Martin uses in Formula One, which is actually a 1.6 liter V6 turbo built by Mercedes. And the Valkyrie uses very advanced aerodynamics to create ground effect under the car. It's like nothing anyone has ever seen before. The performance figures of the Valkyrie are just breathtaking. I mean, it does 0 to 60 in like 2 seconds flat. They're all sold already, so sorry, but you're not going to be able to get one, even if you do have the $2.5 or $3 million that this thing costs.
So there it is.
That's the Valkyrie. Now, it's primarily, its magic is it's essentially a Le Mans car for the street, and it's a little impractical. So Aston Martin decided to do a more streetable version of the Valkyrie called the Valhalla.
And that's what we're looking at here.
And that's what we're looking at here. And it does make an appearance, I believe, in Q's little laboratory. And
it's kind of bulbous.
it is, but if you notice on the flanks of the car, there's some very advanced aerodynamics going on there that generate heaps of downforce.
Man,
and
I have no doubt that this thing flies. I'm just saying it looks a little bit weird.
it's I think it's going to be a 220, 230 mile an hour car, 0 to 60 in like 2 seconds flat, capable of like 1.5 G in lateral acceleration. It's crazy.
It reminds me of something.
Well, currently Mercedes is building their own version of the hypercar, which is going to be called the AMG 1. It's, if you want to show everybody that car and just do AMG ONE.
Damn, that's gonna bug me. Maybe a Lotus or something.
I'm not sure.
AMG what?
AMG ONE 1. Yeah.
Oh, it's cool.
So that's relatively similar. That's kind of a picture of what it'll look like in production. I saw a pre-production model of it, and it features, I believe, in my coverage of the 2019 LA Auto Show, which you guys can search for on Street Muscle magazine. But the actual production version isn't out yet, and this will compete with the Valkyrie and the Valhalla. There have been a few cars in the past. Mercedes released a CLK, a version of the CLK Le Mans car. Do you remember that? Probably like 20 years ago.
I don't know.
You can try looking that up. AMG CLK Le Mans maybe would be a good search.
Well, I want to keep going on this.
Okay, yeah, sure.
Topic.
So those are the primary cars. We were talking before we went live about how there's lots of other cars in this film as well.
Yeah. The ones that stood out to me, I'm getting to here in just a sec, are a couple of SUVs, surprisingly. Actually, the 3 SUVs, right? So 2 of which are late model.
Right.
So you had this here 2020 Land Rover Defender, which was pretty cool.
Yeah, brand new. I actually just saw my first one on the street about a week ago.
Yeah, I haven't seen one in person yet, but in the movie, I thought it was pretty cool. I'm not a huge like Land Rover guy. The classic ones are cool, but like the new ones, they're like, I would buy something American. But
well, the new ones are basically, designed for wealthy people who would never do what you're seeing in that photograph, which is take it off a road.
Unless you're Jeremy Clarkson, it's not going to happen.
Yeah, right. They're very nice cars. They just don't get me, emotionally. I have no real attachment to modern Range Rovers. But there was this one, and what was the other one that was in it? Was it a Sport?
I wanted to mention real quick on this Land Rover Defender that happened in the movie, which I thought was really cool, was he uses that winch right there underneath the grill to like clothesline this guy off a motorcycle who's chasing him, which I thought was really cool.
Yeah.
So that's probably the only time that winch will ever be used, but still very cool.
Right. And what was the other one? The Range Rover Sport. Yeah.
This one was the one that I actually liked a lot, more so than the Land Rover.
Yeah, well, this is the ultimate edition of the full-size Range Rover. And Vinny, should we mention our future podcast and the possible involvement? Well, our next podcast in our series of Build Your Supercar that we've been doing for a while now with Greg Acosta and Vinny and I. Last time we challenged, our first edition was a muscle car shootout between the 3 great American current muscle cars, the Camaro ZL1, the Dodge Challenger Hellcat Red Eye, and the Shelby Mustang GT500. Our next Build Your dream car was pitting the Corvette C8 against mid-engine supercars from around the world, Ferraris, the Acura NSX. What else did we compare?
Audi R8 and
Audi R8. And then our next iteration of our supercar build is actually going to be SUVs. And it's again, America against the world. We're going to pit the Jeep Grand Cherokee Trackhawk against models from England, Germany, Italy, everything that we can find. And this is sure to be one of them. This is a supercharged variant of the standard Range Rover Sport. And it's a pretty killer car, very expensive, but
I'm excited for that build series for this very reason, right? So like this market segment is actually saturated, man. There are so many options for someone who's looking for a family hauler that hauls ass too.
Yeah, and there's more on the way. A lot of you might not know out there, the success of the Lamborghini Urus SUV has prompted Ferrari to build a competitor, and it's got a very strange name. I think it's called the Purosangue, which should be coming out as a 2023, I believe, from the wonderful Gates and Maranello at the Ferrari factory.
I suspect that most of the brands are going to follow suit. They're going to be
well. You know what the thing is, the single largest market in the world for brands like Ferrari and Lamborghini and Aston Martin is the United States. They sell more cars here than anywhere else. And I think they've all just taken a look at what Americans are buying right now. As I'm sure you all know out there, the sedan is kind of going the way of the dodo. No one's buying sedans anymore. And instead, SUVs are predominantly what Americans, and pickups are what Americans are into.
Well, they serve many utilitarian functions that a sedan just can't. You know, those are great for transporting people and they look nice. But I mean, when you think about cargo space and the fuel efficiency that you're gaining by driving a sedan is negligible. You know?
I mean, I have to admit, I've got a burgeoning collection of muscle and sports cars here, but my daily driver is a Grand Cherokee with a Hemi in it. And yeah, for all the reasons Vinny just said, it's you sit up nice and high, so you got a good view of the road and the traffic around you. And like my car with a Hemi in it or the SRT versions of it, the thing hauls. You know, it moves, and yet you can put 6 people in it and stuff a ton of cargo in the back. Very practical for living in LA for me. So
they really are. I was getting at it just a second ago. I think that we're going to start to see brands that are offshoots of major brands. Like I could totally see Corvette expanding and having a Corvette SUV. You know,
very well, now that they've done the Mustang Mach-E, you know, definitely heralds competition from GM and maybe even Mopar as well.
Yeah, well, Mopar's already they're going to be our, let's say, de facto contender in this competition because you know, they have the Trackhawk and the short-lived
right, but rumors are rife that you know, Dodge is going to continue the Challenger and Charger, albeit with new bodies coming soon, either 2023 or 2024. But people are saying Dodge, which is really now the performance brand within the Stellantis empire, Dodge might have its own Durango. You know, they did the limited edition Trackhawk version of the Durango recently with the Hellcat engine in it, but they are probably going to have either a new model completely or a permanent version of the Durango in the lineup that's supercharged and or hybrid.
Yeah, I think that'd be fantastic. As you know, I'm not a Jeep guy. You know, they're okay, but if given the choice, I would purchase a Durango. So I think it's a smart move. Not like, they're not cannibalizing from, the Jeep sales. They're going to sell plenty of them. So
Yeah, and Jeep people typically are Jeep people. Like once you get the Jeep bug, it's kind of a cult, especially with Wranglers. Maybe not quite as religious with Grand Cherokee people.
well, if someone put a gun to my head and they forced me to buy a Jeep, it would be the Cherokee. I think those are pretty cool.
Yeah, and the new ones that are coming out now, I'm a little bit.
Yeah, they look weird, man.
I'm on the fence about the exterior styling, but inside they have taken Grand Cherokees to a whole new level.
Like someone the Cherokee.
Yeah. The exterior styling seems to have involved Fiat a little too much, or now Stellantis, which I'm not sure. They did a very good job, I thought, updating the Wrangler, making it fresh and certainly revitalizing the interior in the latest version of the JL body Wrangler, but kept it very iconic Jeep, very iconic Wrangler, I should say. Not so much with the Grand Cherokee. It's a little odd looking, and you could easily mistake the new Grand Cherokee for like a Japanese SUV, like a Kia or a Nissan.
The one product in the Jeep lineup that I really liked, they kind of ruined for me. But you got to check out the new Bronco, man.
I just saw my first one not too long ago. I'd say a month ago on Ventura Boulevard here in LA. It was a two-door, the full Bronco, not the Bronco Sport.
Right.
Up until then, I had just been seeing a trickle of Bronco Sports on the road, but this was the full-size Bronco two-door in an excellent color. My favorite color that they offer is called Area 51, which is kind of a blue-gray. Mm-hmm. This was, it's slipping my mind now what color it was, but I was duly impressed by the dimensions of the car, the stance, the retro aspect of it. Ford really nailed the Bronco, and I'll bet you, Jeep might have some work to do, because up until now, the Grand Cherokee and the Wrangler were the two best-selling American SUVs, and now they got some serious competition from Ford. So,
been cheaper, and in my opinion, in every form, like in every factor, it's better. That's my opinion. Which is
you actually got to see it up close, and you got rides in it and stuff not too long back. I haven't ridden one yet.
I have driven the new Bronco. I've taken it off road on trails. I have driven Jeeps, and I have driven them off road on trails. For my money, the Bronco, vastly superior. Again, that's way biased. I'm totally biased. But so we were talking about the SUVs in the Bond movie, the newest one. So these two were just two of them. The third one I really love. Do you know which one I'm talking about, Rob?
No, I can't remember. You're gonna have to. You got a good memory, man.
Well, I just saw it this past weekend.
See, I'm the type of person that once I read something, it's in my head forever, which when you default to me to talk about the history of James Bond or the history of Ferrari, or I've read about that stuff so much in my life that it's like I almost have photographic recall on it. But spotting a car in a movie for a split second, no, I'm not as sharp as you. Oh, that's right. I know what you're talking about.
So at first I actually thought it was an international scout, because the scenes in which it's shown in the film are pretty dark. He's driving around Jamaica, and it's late at night, and so right. I thought it was an international scout, but apparently it was a Land Rover, which makes sense.
Which makes more sense. It's got to be British, of course. Yeah, I mean, this is the iconic Series 3 Land Rover that dates back to the 60s and 70s and was the de facto king of off-road for pretty much all those years. Even though the Bronco was in there, the International Scout was in there. If you really wanted to go serious off-roading, you had to do it in a Land Rover because it was the only one that offered like locking diffs and, you know.
I believe that the Toyota, the FJ,
and there was the Land Cruiser, yeah.
Yeah, that was also up there. My grandfather, who lived in Africa at the time, had many of them, and he swears by
Yeah, and if y'all have been watching recent Mecum and Barrett Jackson auctions, those FJs are now going for ridiculous money, like six figures for what was, you know, it was a quality car. They last forever, but was never ever valuable from the day it left the factory until just quite recently. Now people are restoring them and they're selling for close to $200,000 now, which is nuts deluxe if you ask me. But they're cool. Don't get me wrong.
Awesome. You got the hood and everything. It's very cool.
Yeah.
Everybody at home, this is a perfect example of why we're talking about this right now. Some of you at home might be thinking, why the hell are you guys talking about a James Bond movie? Like, what does that have to do with street muscle? What does that have to do with the automotive industry or automotive culture in general? Well, it has everything to do with it because of all the cars that we've been talking about so far. In this movie alone, James Bond has driven not only like an awesome motorcycle, several different relevant SUVs in today's market. He's driven this classic SUV. He's driven what, three different Aston Martins. So it's a very important film, a very important franchise when you start talking about cars.
Yeah, and after I went to the press screening and Vinny got home from a much well-earned recent vacation he was on, the first thing we talked about was, I was like, dude, I wish there were just a couple of American cars in this Bond film, because then I could have the excuse of doing a Rob's car movie review on it, because there's just so much automotive action. But sadly, you know, Street Muscle's focus is really on American muscle for the most part. And there unfortunately isn't one American car that I recall in it that was of any real relevance. So
this is our way of giving you a Rob's movie review
without me having to go through the horror of actually writing it for you.
Don't pretend like you don't love doing those every month.
Oh, yeah, I'm pretending to. I've been doing it for 5 years now, and I should say, I mentioned that next week y'all should have a new one, which marks not only the 5-year mark for that column, but also the 50th actual movie review that I've done. So look for that next week. I'm not going to tell you all what the movie is.
That's cool.
Yeah.
Oh, so what I was going to tell you, right? We hadn't really, so for everybody at home, Rob and I haven't really had a chance to catch up since I came back from vacation. We talked a little bit about work, but other than that, not much. So Rob, while I was on vacation in Costa Rica, Central America, I had reserved a rental car, and the rental car that I had reserved was a Suzuki Jimny, or Jimmy, I guess, which is, for everybody at home, it's kind of like a really small Jeep. It looks almost, I'll just pull up a picture. But as luck would have it, they didn't have one for me. So, and I saw a bunch of them while I was down there. So that's the Suzuki Jimny. And I was really excited about driving it because I was like, oh, cool. You know, I'm going to take it off-roading. Plenty of places to do that, by the way. And so when they told me that they didn't have one, I was so bummed. And you should have seen the cars that they wanted to give me instead. They were four-wheel drive, but they were so boring. They were like some Toyota. It looked like a overgrown Camry. It was so boring.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is a cool little off-roader. I don't think it's for the American market. You can't get one here, but it reminds me of the Suzuki Samurai, the infamous Suzuki Samurai from back in the late 80s and 90s, which had rollover problems, as I recall.
Wow.
The way the mass of the car was distributed, it was prone in accidents and at certain angles of terrain to just go ass over tea kettle. And there was a big furor about it. And I think Suzuki had to redesign the car to some extent to improve the handling.
Homage to that, you know.
Yeah.
But that era was there were a lot of these little off-roaders like this thing. They had back then they had the Geo Tracker, which was really popular.
I remember that.
A bunch of little Toyota pickup trucks. Well, anyways,
There was also, wasn't there a Mitsubishi small off-roader back then?
Oh yeah, the Montero.
Montero, yeah. And it was kind of the one really cool thing about the Montero is on the dashboard, there was one of those ball compasses that was filled with fluid.
Yeah.
And it was just very aeronautic touch to it. And I was in one once and admired that came standard, like a, you know, floating in water compass ball. It was pretty cool.
So dig this, man. I don't get the Jimmy, right? So I'm bummed out. I'm in Central America. I'm down in Costa Rica. I have all this lush jungle around me. My girlfriend and I drove up to the mountains. Actually, we spent most of our time horseback riding. So you needed a 4-wheel drive to get where we were going. So I'm kind of like going back and forth with the guy who works at Enterprise. I was treated very well by Enterprise, by the way, other than the fact that they didn't have Jimmy. But I ended up getting something way cooler, in my opinion.
Which was?
It was, maybe you can guess, it's a favorite among special operations forces working on clandestine missions overseas. Also, their terrorist opposition and like off-roaders everywhere outside of the United States.
Wow, that's a tough question. Can you give me the country of origin?
Japan.
You can't?
Japan.
Oh, Japan. I'm gonna guess it was a Toyota product of some kind, perhaps a Land Cruiser. Helix.
A Toyota.
Right.
Hilux.
Right.
So, for everyone at home, if you're not familiar with the Toyota Helix or Hilux, it is, yeah, like I said, a favorite among off-roaders the world over outside of the United States because you can't get one there. So it's, think of a Tacoma, but smaller. And I don't know what this one was powered by, but it boogied all over that country, man. I drove hundreds of miles.
Wow.
Over the course of like a week and a half in this thing.
Was it a stick or an automatic?
It was a stick.
Nice.
Yeah.
Nice.
So,
you can't even rent a stick in America anymore, I don't think. Like there's only like 3 cars like that even have sticks in them. And Vinny and I are big stick guys. We're still dyed in the wool, row it yourself folks. So
I had this little thing humming around Costa Rica through, like I said, this lush jungle, and all the roads there, they don't have an interstate highway system like we do here in the United States. So most of their roads are very twisty and windy, and you could spend an hour and a half going 30 miles. It's just
in fact, isn't the only like major thoroughfare through all the Central American countries, isn't it Route 1?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I mean, aside from that, there's really no highways or anything like. Well, Mexico has highways, but
they're very short, and it's only around like the huge metropolitan areas.
Right.
So where we were at, I was whipping this little thing around these awesome twisty mountain roads and off-roading in the mud and the rocks and the gravel. I had such a good time. And while I was driving around, I was listening to I don't know if you're familiar with Jack Carr.
No.
He's an author, former Green Beret, former Special Forces, former CIA operative. So I was listening to one of his books, and I just felt like James Bond in this little
In the jungle. Yeah, that's pretty cool.
and so then I came home and I watched James Bond. So
Is your girl did she appreciate zipping around the jungle and that thing? Is she an action junkie like you, or?
yeah, we had a fantastic time, man. So one of the things that we wanted to do while we were there was like I said, spend a lot of time horseback riding. She grew up riding horses. She was did a lot of English riding and jumping. So she's a very accomplished rider. And I'm okay. I've ridden horses my whole life, not a whole lot though, you know. So getting out into the mountains, I mean, it was just one big adventure, man.
Nice. We did have a moment to discuss the fact that you did some zip lining, which she was not as enamored with.
No, she wasn't into that. Because she's, like I said, she's an adrenaline junkie. We've gone skydiving. We've done a bunch of different, like whitewater rafting plenty of times. We've been in some hairy situations, rock climbing. She's down, but for whatever reason, she wasn't feeling the zip line.
Wasn't happy. Didn't trust those Costa Rican bungees and zip lines. And
I guess not. You know, most people I think would have that normal fear, like where they're thinking about like, is this thing going to hold me? I never done that stuff.
Well, my thought would be, how often do they actually do maintenance or inspections on these lines? You know, that would be my worry. But
yeah, I don't know. I don't think about that stuff. If it's my time, it's my time, I suppose.
Well, I'm like you, and especially when I was younger and had a better, more healthy back, I was just like you. I was into, you know, all of this stuff, the whitewater rafting, the adventuring, racing cars, the whole nut. I was really after that adrenaline jolt. And, you know, I'm a little older than you. I'm 51, going to be 52 in a couple of months with a bad back.
Yeah, you look great for 51. Jesus.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. But, you know, it's better to look good than to feel good. But I don't always feel good is my point. So the motorcycles and you know, the whitewater rafting, I think that's mostly in my past now, but sadly.
You don't dye the beard?
What's that?
You don't dye the beard?
Let's talk more about James Bond, right? Okay. Well, I'll give you this. I don't dye my hair. Okay. I'll give you that.
That's what I was bringing up because I just turned 32. That's why we were down in Costa Rica for my birthday.
Right.
So I just turned 32, and my mustache is already starting to get like light.
Yeah. Okay. If you want to get into it, yeah, I don't so much mind that I'm getting gray in my beard. The problem I'm encountering is when it gets to a certain length, it's patchy gray. If it was uniform gray, I'd be like, hey, it's all part of, you know,
interesting man in the world,
looking more distinguished. Exactly, like the most interesting man in the world. But yeah, I've been getting this patchy phenomenon, and then it's time for a little, I'll admit it, a little just for men. But just to even it out, like not across the whole beard, it's just to hit those patches. But up here, this is all au naturel up here.
Yeah, I wonder why that is, because my hair is like jet black, but I'll get occasional like whites or whatever in my beard.
Yeah, I don't know. I have dark brown hair, and I don't have a lot of gray on my head. I've got more gray in my beard than on my head. But like I said, it's just like over here. Remember when the E channel first hit television, there was a guy who was a host of E! News, and he had a white spot on the side of his hair. He called himself the skunk, because I can't remember the guy's name. He was the guy that hosted before Joe McHale. And he had like one, it was like a birthmark. He had a white spot in his hair. I feel like that guy, you know, that I'm like the skunk. I might start writing my columns under that pen name, the skunk. The Skunk's Car Movie Review.
No, I don't think that has good a ring to it as Rob's.
Yeah. All right.
But so just kind of like wrap things up. We've talked about the cars, we've talked about the actual movie as a whole, we've talked about the history of James Bond. Rob, since you don't get to write the article, that I know you really want to. If you were to give everyone at home your summation or your how do you usually, you'll do it like a piston?
Well, yeah, a long time ago, I devised a rating system of pistons out of 10. I should have maybe thought 12 pistons, because like the ultimate is a V12, but I went from 1 piston to 10. And the highest ranked film, I'm very conservative with my rankings. And I've always been that way, because for me, even though some could argue I'm ranking these films against just other car movies, the way I review the films in my articles is to talk also not just about the quality of cars and automotive action, but the quality of the film as a piece of filmmaking. And, to me, if you were going to assign 10 pistons to anything, well, it's going to be The Godfather, it's going to be Apocalypse Now, it's going to be 2001: A Space Odyssey. And so I've never given a 10 to a car movie before. The two highest ratings I've given out in my articles went to the original Vanishing Point and a contemporary of that film, which was Two Lane Blacktop, which happens to be my favorite car movie of all time. Also, American Graffiti. Those 3 were my highest.
I thought you didn't care for Two Lane Blacktop because of the car, because of the 55.
No. Two Lane Blacktop, as a film, and there are other cars in it too. There's an original 1970 Hemi Cuda in Limelight or Sassy Grass, one or the other. Yeah, I mean, there's some serious cars in that film, and just as a piece of filmmaking, Two Lane Blacktop is an excellent film. And of course, American Graffiti, which is one of the classic American films of the 1970s. Those all got 8s. Okay. And that's the highest I've given. Either an 8 or an 8.5 is the highest I've given.
That's something that I do appreciate about Rob's car movie review, and that's that you're not just reviewing the cars. It's a comprehensive look at the film itself, which is absolutely why we did an offshoot of that and started doing Rob's Movie Muscles to examine specific cars.
Just the cars, yeah. So when I do the reviews, I'm looking at, certainly I factor in the quality of cars that are in the film, the quality of the stunts and stuff like that, but I combine it with an overall, the overall quality of the film. Would you want me to break my ratings down right now, give 1 rating for the film and 1 for the cars in the film, or do you want me to do it the way I do it in the article?
Do it the way that you normally do in your articles.
I think No Time to Die, considering all the factors that we just mentioned, I would give the film 7 out of 10 pistons, which is up there for me.
Stellar rating.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the best Bond films out of the past 20 years. I think that, and I really like Casino Royale. And as we've shown everybody, the cars in the film are incredible. If y'all go out and see it or wait for it to stream, you'll see what they do with the cars is top notch. And it was all practical stunts, as we mentioned at the very beginning of this podcast. There's
minus the whole Gatling gun thing, but yeah.
Yeah, the Gatling gun thing. Yeah, that's why I mentioned it, because it was kind of goofy, but the actual, stunts themselves, you can clearly tell these are cars going off cliffs and being beaten to hell and stuff like that. So props for that, definitely. And hey, man, it's a bunch of Aston Martins. You don't get much better than that, right?
Yeah, dude. It was I think you put it perfectly. It was a great end to the Daniel Craig era of Bond, and it was a great Bond movie in general. One of the best.
Yeah, I agree. Liked it very much, and thank you again for getting me in there. It was a treat.
For sure.
First time in a movie theater, and wow. You know, I'm like you mentioned before, you used to go to the movies all the time. And even before COVID it started to taper off for you. The same thing happened to me when my wife and I moved out here to Malibu. The house we bought, we're fortunate enough so that it actually has an extra room, which is just to my right, that we converted into a home theater. And I went ahead and put in some rather high-end audio components, Bowers and Wilkins speakers, some Nakamichi, old vintage Nakamichi handmade audio equipment. We got, like, I think it's a 78-inch or 72-inch flat screen in there, full Dolby surround, Dolby Atmos, the whole thing. And, the TV streams Netflix and Amazon Prime. And it was a godsend during the heat of the pandemic, because I'd just go in there and get lost for hours, download streaming stuff. I also have a DVD and Blu-ray player. I got my own collection of my favorite films, actually physically on discs, because I'm a geek like that. And I started noticing I wasn't going to movie theaters anymore either, because they started streaming things at the same time of theatrical releases a lot of the time, like starting about 5 years ago. And during the pandemic, there were no movie theaters, so everything was streamed. And you can still get me back to a theater pretty easily if it's a director I really care about, a subject I'm passionate about. But I think, sadly, my days of, just going to see everything in the theater are well behind me.
Some of them, some films just deserve it, right? So this one for me was one of them. This was one of the first films I had looked forward to in a long time, and they made us wait 3 years almost for this thing.
Yeah, we didn't even touch on that. There were a number of reasons why that happened.
Yeah.
To make a long story short, Christoph Waltz was, there were problems negotiating with him to reprise the role of Blofeld. And then there were some early production delays because Daniel Craig got an ankle injury doing a physical stunt himself, and he was laid up for several months. And then COVID hit. This thing was supposed to have been released a year ago. And they sat on it because, and I think wisely so, this is a movie that kind of demands seeing it in the theater. This is a film I personally would have gone to see in the theater. It would have gotten me out anyway, even if I didn't get to go to the press screening.
Yeah, I'm not waiting at the box office to buy tickets to see the next Avengers, but for James Bond, yes.
Yeah. You know what the problems for me are lately? If you're going to go on a date with your wife, girlfriend, what have you, to a movie, they charge you $20 for parking. Popcorn is now $11, and a Coke is $9, and the movie ticket itself is $18, and then they hit you for all of that. Plus, either before or after the movie, you're gonna take your partner to dinner, all in just to go out in the movies and get dinner these days. That's like an expensive night, and
dollars at least.
Yeah, and you sit in the theater, and sometimes you got the kids, crying, or you got people talking, and and now we all have to deal with our own personal views on the pandemic, and sitting enclosed in a theater, arm in arm, elbow to elbow with strangers. There's like a whole host of things. And then you think to yourself, man, I can go 10 feet that way, sitting there in my underwear, with Domino's or whatever I want, Chinese food or whatever I order in. I don't even have to leave the house, and it costs me virtually, it's a streaming fee.
And the cool thing about that too is, like, if you don't have a collection like your own, there's a compendium of films online. You just hunt it up on Amazon Prime. Like my girlfriend had never seen Scream the other day. So I said, oh, Scream, my favorite slasher movie of all time. Pulled it up, watched it for $3 on Amazon. So
yeah, Prime actually has become a godsend for me because in Rob's car movie review, I've hit most of the big ones, and when I say big, I mean the ones that everybody expected me to review early on: The Vanishing Points, the even Need for Speed, all the the Gumball Rally, all the really famous big car movies I've already done. So now I'm trying to find the ones that people don't know so much about, because I've covered all the big ones, A, and B, I personally love discovering little gem films that some of them I've never even heard of. And Prime, it used to be, well, I probably shouldn't say this live on a podcast, but sometimes I would have to go to, let's just say, Measures to procure a film. Right. If Netflix didn't have it, if your video store didn't have it, you had to find it to review it. I always comforted myself knowing that what I was doing was probably not a crime, because I'm reviewing it for a publication, which kind of makes the movie not public domain. But if you're reviewing a film, you're given certain license that you wouldn't be if it's just for personal use. But Prime now has replaced all of my, removed all of my problems, because they've got films on there I have never heard of, car movies from the early 70s, drive-in type grindhouse films.
You got your tax broker and see about writing off your Amazon.
Yeah, my streaming subscription prices and stuff. Yeah, absolutely. But I used to have to wait. When I first started writing this column, Netflix, as far as streaming was concerned, was a fledgling thing. The speeds weren't that great, and their offerings weren't that great. And very often I'd still have to locate DVDs or Blu-rays of certain films. And now everything's on Prime, and it's and or Netflix. It's a godsend for me.
It's interesting when we're in positions where, like the pandemic, where you were watching a lot of films. Whenever I was deployed back in 2010, 2011, I was watching tons of film. I downloaded so many movies to watch, and that's actually when I watched all of the James Bond catalog for the first time. I had downloaded every James Bond film.
Oh, did you watch them in chronological order?
Yeah,
I've done that with not only James Bond films, a couple other franchises where I took them chronologically. And like I did the Godfather series once, and I even watched Godfather 3, which was like hard. It was tough. But, just touching on James Bond, I guess to wrap up, there is no franchise quite like it. No franchise has more installments. No franchise has made more money. No franchise has made so many things, as we mentioned, watches, cars, you name it, iconic. Nor, I'd venture to say, no franchise has offered more lines of dialogue into our lexicon. Bond, James Bond is one of the most iconic lines in history. Shaken not stirred. It's just, it's given so much to the world, and I think, or I should say, lent so much to the world. I think that's why after all these years, from 1962 to 2021, audiences go.
Yeah.
They love it. You know, it's never gotten fully played out. You know, I'd argue it came close to almost parodying itself in a certain era, where things just got over the top. But audiences still went. I still went.
Some franchise, or not franchises, but some films started to do its own genre a little bit better, and it was around that time that we saw the change in Bond, like the Bourne series. Fantastic, right? And that borrowed a lot of Cloak and Dagger from James Bond. And
Sure.
so when you're watching James Bond and you see Pierce Brosnan and it's kind of like hokey, and then you go and see the Jason Bourne series and you're like, oh, this is cool.
Yeah.
You know,
And Mission Impossible as well. Like the first Mission Impossible, which was directed by Brian De Palma, obviously a very famous director. A lot of people hated the first Mission Impossible. It was really Mission Impossible as old timers knew it, in title only. There were really, you know, the Barbara Bain character, the Martin Landau character. It wasn't like that. They didn't reprise those characters or roles. You know, it had the title, it had the theme song, and that was it. So it got kind of trashed by critics. I would ask everybody who feels that way or felt that way in 1999, I guess, when the first Mission Impossible came out with Tom Cruise, go back and watch that movie. It's an excellent film. It's a bit convoluted. You need to pay attention, just like No Time to Die. You really need to follow what's going on. But that first Mission Impossible movie did what this movie did for me, which was to portray a realistic, somewhat dark, cynical, you know, spy versus spy or spy versus villain genre film. And that's essentially what James Bond has always been. It's a genre film.
Yeah.
So I liked it a lot. Glad I went. I encourage everybody out there to do the same. If you love James Bond and if you love Aston Martins, you will like this movie.
A stellar review as always, Rob. Thank you so much for coming on and talking to us about your experience watching the film and giving us a review and a history of James Bond and a little bit of everything else. So thanks.
Absolutely. It's always a joy to spend a little time with you, spend a little time with everybody out there. And you'll be seeing the two of us together with Greg again, hopefully in about a week's time with, as I said, a new Build Your Supercar challenge with SUVs, hyper SUVs. And I will have a new Rob's car movie review out by the end of the week. And I think after that, maybe a Rob's movie muscle.
Yeah, sure. So everybody at home, keep an eye out for those. And Rob, we will see you next time, buddy.
All right, man. Take care. See y'all.
Well, Greg, there you have it, man. Rob and I talked for like 3 hours about James Bond. Did you get bored?
No, dude, James Bond is James Bond, man. Like, I don't know. Even let be honest, the most boring James Bond movie that you can think of, you know, that's the most boring for you, is still a good movie, right? Really?
Well, like you know, the George Lazenby era is not my favorite.
But that's
he only did one, and
that's
then,
an actor, not the movie, right? Like,
yeah. Well, okay, so I've tried to go back and watch like the Brosnan era stuff, and it's, you know, like Rob and I were talking about, it's so hokey that it's kind of like painful to watch now.
how can you call Brosnan hokey?
Well, okay, so it's not his fault. I think Brosnan was like the most Bond there is. He was,
No, you can't take that away from Connery.
well, okay, so
He's up there. He's up. Don't get me wrong, but I'm just, Connery is number one. Period. Done. We're good.
what I mean is, for me, he is not my favorite Bond, but I think he's the most like iconic Bond, like where you would ask people of our generation
Okay.
about James Bond, they would say Pierce Brosnan. He's like smooth, he's suave, he's like got the accent, the whole deal, right? Sean Connery was a little bit more brash. He was kind of like Daniel Craig in that they were both, you know, they would like fight a lot, you know, hand-to-hand combat. And James Bond, the Brosnan era was more about gadgetry and like explosions and, you know, Michael Bay kind of stunts. And so they were a little bit different in that way. So back to your point, I can't really watch those movies with as much appreciation anymore. As a kid, when they came out, I was all about it, dude. GoldenEye, are you kidding me? Awesome.
Nintendo 64, probably the most iconic Nintendo game, short of you know, Mario Brothers and Duck Hunt, and you know.
Exactly. So I was all about that, right? But nowadays, I prefer the realism of the Craig era Bond. And when I go back and I watch the classics with Sean Connery, the like kind of like one-liners and like the dry humor, I really appreciate that. So yeah, I don't know.
I mean, I got to be honest, Daniel Craig took a while for me to warm up to.
Yeah.
I was not out of the gate. Yay, Daniel Craig is a great Bond.
Neither was I. And I think it stems from that, like we were so used to Pierce Brosnan, right? We were so used to his style of Bond.
Yeah. But I mean, he came around,
Yeah.
you know, he's definitely up there. I mean, to say he's top 3 Bond, I think is a huge thing.
Yeah, that's huge, but he's earned it.
Yeah, I definitely think he's top 3.
Yeah, man. I mean, I just recently went back and watched Casino Royale. Love that movie. And I wasn't like you, I wasn't crazy about it when it first came out. But now I watch it, I'm like, oh, this is a really good movie. So, you know, kudos to him. Kudos to the team that put out the newest Bond. It was a really great movie going experience. I haven't been to the movies, like actual theater, in a long time. And I really enjoyed it. So thank you to everybody who had a part in making the film. I know it was like tough for them, you know, going through like having to do it through COVID. Daniel Craig suffered an injury. Man, they had setback after setback. So to finally see it come to fruition.
Well, is Daniel Craig the most injured Bond actor? No, I mean, seriously, like he's had quite a few on-set injuries, hasn't he?
Maybe, which is funny because you would think like during his era, they're not doing that many of their own stunts, but I guess he is.
Yeah. But I mean, at the end of the day, you know, kind of makes him tough like Bond, right? It gives him some Bond cred. I mean, I don't know. I
really liked the aspect of the film this time around. There was so much automotive content in this one. You know, he drove a lot of the Bond cars in this movie. And then he, you know, there was a really great motorcycle scene too. And I really appreciated it. It was really cool. And I think a lot of the stunts were actually performed with real vehicles in this movie, which was refreshing, as Rob touched on. And those are the key takeaways that I have from the film. It was great. For those of you who haven't seen it at home and suffered through our spoilers, thank you, first of all. But also go check it out. It's a really great film if you're a fan of the Bond series, or if you just want to check out a good movie. It's a good watch.
Yeah,
Greg,
I'm gonna have to go watch it now.
Yeah, dude. As we wrap up, what do you have for the people? What's going on Engine Lab?
Right now, just stay tuned. I promise. It's there's a lot of stuff coming. I have a dining room full of boxes for projects. Things are starting to move. We're about to have some really cool stuff.
Right on, dude. I know you have your hands full with like several projects right now, as do I. Making good progress on the C10, that LS swap. You and I this past weekend were working. I was on the phone with you, troubleshooting some stuff. You know, we're in the final stages of that one, which I'm really excited about. Can't wait to get it on the road and start driving it. But other than that, You guys can always check out our tech and features on both enginelabs.com and streetmusclemag.com. We are constantly publishing news and features, tech, and everything in between. If it's automotive related, you can find it there. So thanks for tuning in. Before we sign off, I'd like to take a moment and thank our sponsors, because without them and without our viewers, none of this would be possible. Of course, those sponsors are Performance Distributors, ProCharger, ARP, Liqui Moly, Silver Sport Transmissions, Holley Performance Brands, Optima, Performance Online, and of course, our title sponsor, Lucas Oil. So thank you to them. If you're looking for or are in the market for any aftermarket goods, that includes hard parts, lubricants, what have you, check out their websites. You can find them in the link in the description below. So until then, we'll check you out next time.